Everyone doing tonight? Yeah, this is our fourth and final event for our centennial celebration. It's been a great year. And it really is a special night as we celebrate 100 years at Sara Bay, especially meaningful to welcome someone whose family has been a part of golf's very soul. We are privileged to be joined tonight by Bobby Jones IV, grandson of the legendary Bobby Jones. Dr. Jones is a respected sports psychologist at the Behavioral Institute of Atlanta. He also travels the country sharing stories of his grandfather's character, sportsmanship, and love of the game. It's a legacy that still shapes golf today. What makes tonight truly special is his grandfather's connection to Sarasota and Sara Bay during our early years, tying his story directly to ours. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Bobby Jones IV.
Well, good evening. What a privilege it is to be here at Sara Bay on this occasion, the eve of the 100th anniversary of the match that brings us together tonight. The match of the century between Bobby Jones and Walter Haig was a defining moment in the history of golf in Florida and even more in the United States. The reason for this will become apparent as we move forward tonight. I'm here today because of the man my family called Bub. I should explain this right away because I intend to use that nickname throughout the evening, and I want you to know who I mean. Bub was our family's nickname, the grandchildren's nickname, for a man the rest of the world knew as Bobby Jones. Robert Tyre Jones, Jr., my grandfather. I've been telling stories about Bub for many years now to audiences of all kinds, and I've found that the questions people ask are almost always the same at their core. What was he really like? What drove him? What kind of man was he when the cameras weren't rolling and the galleries had gone home? I hope to answer some of those questions this evening, but I also want to tell you about another man, Walter Haig, known to the golf world simply as the Haig, and about the remarkable relationship between these two giants of the game. And I want to tell you about that relationship in a particular context, here in Sarasota, on ground that both of them knew and loved. So tonight, I'd like to take you back to a time when golf was young. The Florida air smelled of salt and possibility, and two very, very different men deepened a friendship that had already been fired in the crucible of competition. Whenever I speak about Bub and this era of golf, I'm aware that I'm asking you to care about people who lived more than a century ago, and I know that's a big ask. So let me try to earn it. Bobby Jones was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1902. The same year that air conditioning was invented, by the way, which may explain why a Georgian could become as comfortable in Florida as he did. He was a sickly child given to digestive ailments, and his parents were advised that outdoor activity and fresh air might do him some good. They moved to a house near the Atlanta Athletic Club's East Lake Country Club in what was then the outskirts of Atlanta and what we now call downtown. In 1907, when Bub was 5 years old, a man named Stuart Maiden became the club's professional. Stuart was blessed with a syrupy, smooth, upright swing of tremendous power. But Bub's own golf began even more humbly than that. Years later, he would describe his beginnings. He said, "Being just a little boy, a friend of my father's gave me a cut-down club and a ball, and that made it pretty simple. I was 5 years old at the time and cut 2 holes in the dirt road in the front of the house about 50 yards apart. I'd spend hours every day banging that ball up and down the road, covering it with electrical tape when the cuts would become too pronounced. When he eventually watched Maiden swing, he had a model worth imitating and a year of obsessive repetition already behind him. What Bub went on to accomplish in golf is almost beyond comprehension by any measure. He played in his first national championship in 1916 when he was just 14 years old. From 1923 until 1930, he won 13 major championships using the definition of majors as they were understood in his era. During those 8 short years, he won 5 United States Amateurs, 4 United States Opens, 3 British Opens, and 1 British Amateur. He did this before retiring from competitive golf at the age of 28. 28. In 1930, the year of his retirement, he accomplished something that had never been done before and has never been done since. He won all 4 major championships in a single calendar year: the British Amateur, the British Open, the U.S. Open, and the U.S. Amateur. The golf world called it the Grand Slam. Upon his return to New York after his triumph in the 2 British championships, the ticker tape parade the city threw for him — it was the second ticker tape parade New York threw for him — was larger than the one they had given Charles Lindbergh after his transatlantic flight. And then he walked away. At the peak of his powers, with the world at his feet, he retired. He said the game had taken too much out of him emotionally. He went back to Atlanta, went back to the practice of law, and eventually, with a golf course architect named Alistair Mackenzie, designed Augusta National Golf Club. But here's what I want you to understand about Bub that the record books don't fully capture. He was a man of almost painful sensitivity. He felt things deeply. He was, by his own admission, a fierce and sometimes tortured competitor. He once said that he played his best golf in a fog, that the intensity of concentration required was so total that he could barely remember the shots afterward. When he was young, he was a notorious club thrower, agonizing over poor shots with a ferocity that alarmed spectators. In fact, in his very first national championship, that 1916 U.S. Amateur, he was paired against a former champion named Eben Byers, who was also known for letting clubs fly. After Bub beat Byers 1-up, he was asked how he did it. "Simple," the young boy responded. "Mr. Byers ran out of clubs first." Later, after he had mastered his temper in competition, he became known as a man of extraordinary grace, warmth, and humor. Beloved not just as a champion, but as a person. Years later, Gene Sarazen would say of Bub, "Bob was a fierce competitor, but a kind man. He always gave you the feeling that you were playing against a friend," and you were. Now, Walter Hagen. If Bobby Jones was the gold standard of the gentleman amateur, Walter Hagen was his glorious, outrageous opposite. Born in Rochester, New York in 1892, 10 years before Bub, Hagen grew up working class. He became a golf professional at a time when professionals were treated, well, frankly, as servants. They were not permitted to enter the clubhouses of the clubs where they competed. They changed their shoes in the parking lot, and they ate their lunches outdoors. Hagen chafed against what he considered a slight to his profession and decided to do everything he could to put a stop to all that. He showed up at tournaments in a chauffeured limousine, and had his lunch served inside the car directly in front of the clubhouse doors that had been closed to him. He wore +4s, or what we frequently refer to as knickers, two-tone shoes, and silk shirts. He played the game with a swagger and showmanship that were entirely his own. He won 11 major championships, was the first American-born golfer to win the British Open, and then he won it 3 more times. He combined this with 5 PGA championships and 2 U.S. Open titles. Those who analyzed Hagen's swing noted the influence of his baseball-playing youth. His stance was unusually wide, his swing plane flatter than most, and he threw his weight into the ball with a force that some found ungainly, but none could argue with. He was entirely his own invention as a golfer. No teacher's model, no borrowed technique, and while others, Jones among them, were admired for their elegance and the precision of their swings, what set Hagen apart was something less visible, an iron competitive mind and a tactical shrewdness that no opponent ever fully solved. Results were what mattered to him. How he got them was nobody's business but his own. Robert Harlow, Hagen's close friend and manager, put it best. He said, "If Walter got into a game of tiddlywinks with a couple of kids on the nursery floor, he would try as hard to beat them as he did to win the British Open." There's so much about Hagen that captures the imagination. For example, he was said to be a man who loved life with an almost reckless enthusiasm, staying up late and drinking freely. The myth of Sir Walter, as even my grandfather called him, was that he kept a crowd waiting on the tee while he stopped to watch a sunset. He is even supposed to have once said, "I only expect to hit about 4 shots perfectly around, so I don't get frustrated by a bad one." However, the truth, as is often the case, was rather more complicated. Historian Stephen Lowe recounts the great golf writer Herbert Warren Wind once quipping that Hagen had broken 11 of the 10 commandments and kept on going. But as Lowe noted, much of this was legend. Hagen actually took decent care of himself during his playing days and drank far less than was commonly believed. Sir Walter once said, "I could make one highball last longer in my own glass than any Scotsman ever born." As for the late nights, he confessed that he often had little choice. He simply could not sleep before major competitions. The wild reputation, it seems, was at least partly a performance. And as performances go, it was a masterpiece. Nothing unsettled an opponent quite like the belief that the man across the tee had been up until 3 in the morning and didn't care. So there you have them. The Southern gentleman amateur, disciplined, sensitive, internally combusting with competitive fire, and the brash Yankee professional, flamboyant, unflappable, turning the mere act of existing into a performance. What in the world could these two men have in common? As it turns out, everything that mattered. Before we get to the match, let's spend a few moments talking about Bub's relationship with this community, with Sarasota, with Whitfield Estates, with the very ground you're sitting on. To understand that relationship, you have to understand another name, Adair, specifically George Adair and his family. George Adair was an Atlanta real estate man and a passionate golfer who became one of the most important figures in Bub's early life. When Bub was barely in his teens, Adair recognized something extraordinary in him. He arranged with my great-grandfather for Bub to compete in the 1916 U.S. Amateur at Marion Golf Club outside of Philadelphia. Bub's primary reason for the trip was simple enough: to keep George's son, Perry, company. Perry was the original Dixie Whiz Kid, the shining star of Southern golf. But something happened on those Marion fairways that nobody had quite anticipated. Bub became the star of the tournament. He won the qualifying medal and made it to the second round of match play before losing to two-time U.S. amateur champion Robert A. Gardner. Bub, as I said before, was 14 years old. George Adair later said that he believed from that moment that Bub would become the finest golfer the world had ever seen. Well, memory, of course, has a way of becoming more prophetic with the passage of time, and it's doubtful that Adair actually said that at the time, and even if he didn't, George can be forgiven. He turned out to be right. The Adair family's connection to Sarasota was part of what wove Bub into the fabric of this community. By the time he came here, he had earned 2 bachelor's degrees, one in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech and another in English literature from Harvard. Yeah. And yet, for all of that, he had no clear sense of what he wanted to do with his life. It was George Adair who provided direction. He suggested that Bub come south to sell real estate at Whitfield Estates and to represent Whitfield Estates in the golf world. Through the Adairs, Bobby Jones came to know and love this part of Florida. It was not just a place he passed through. It was a place where he felt at home. The city made that abundantly clear. Sarasota was one of only 3 cities in the country, along with New York and Atlanta, that would honor him with a victory parade during his entire career. The city of Sarasota presented him with the key to the city. And if that weren't enough, they also gave him a brand new Pierce Arrow automobile, which he proceeded to drive through the streets of Sarasota at what can only be described as characteristically high speeds, in a city where it should be noted he already had the key. Years later, when Bub arrived in New York on business, his law partner Arthur Howell was stunned to see police cars waiting at the gate at Idlewild Airport. They were there to provide a police escort to Bub to his hotel in Manhattan. To the shocked Howell, Bub simply said in his thick Atlanta drawl, "Well, Arthur, what's the point in having the key to a city if you don't use it to turn a lock every now and then?" It was a lesson he may well have learned here in Sarasota. Whitfield Estates, this neighborhood, this club's neighborhood, was a sparkly new and elegant design with a classic Donald Ross golf course. And when you understand that Bobby Jones was drawn to places of genuine quality and genuine warmth, it makes complete sense that he would have been at ease here. He was not a man who was comfortable in every room. He was uncomfortable, actually, with a great deal of the attention that his fame brought him. But there were communities and there were people in whose company he relaxed. Sarasota was one of those places. The Sarasota of the 1920s was a city in the process of becoming ambitious, elegant, full of civic energy. It had the sea and sunlight that have always made this coastline irresistible. And it had people who understood and valued excellence in architecture, in culture, in sport. Bobby Jones fit naturally into that world. I think about what it must have been like for him to come down here, away from Atlanta, away from the expectations that followed him everywhere, and simply play golf on these Donald Ross fairways, among people who cared for him as a friend rather than a famous person. These respites mattered to him. They were a part of how he sustained the inner equilibrium that his competitive life demanded. And it was here, in Sarasota, on the grounds of what is now Sara Bay, that one of the most famous golf matches in history was staged. Which brings me to February of 1926. By 1926, Walter Hagen was the undisputed king of professional golf, and Bobby Jones was the undisputed king of amateur golf. The question the golf world wanted answered, the question that had been simmering for years, was simple. Which one of them was actually better? Well, by the end of 1926, there would be no question as to who the dominant golfer was. Bub would capture the Open Championships of both Great Britain and the United States and cement his standing as the greatest golfer in the world. However, in February, his claim to that title was by no means certain. A challenge match was arranged, 72 holes in total, 36 here in Sarasota, and 36 a week later at the Pasadena Yacht and Country Club in St. Petersburg, where Hagen served as club president and was contractually obligated to appear for 4 months each year, an arrangement for which he was paid $30,000. I think the rate for club presidents has gone down since then. The format was 4 rounds of head-to-head match play. It was a match between 2 men who had something more important than money to play for. The press said they were competing for the right to be called the best golfer in the world. Well, now, neither Bub nor Hagen would have agreed with that characterization, but neither would dare disagree publicly. But for Hagen, however, the match carried a deeper personal meaning. He was genuinely fond of Bub. There was never much question about that. But he had spent his career chafing under the patrician thumb of the amateur golf establishment, which had long regarded the professional player as a hired hand rather than an equal. This match, in his mind, was something more than a friendly contest between 2 champions. It was an opportunity to settle a score, to settle once and for all the question of whether the professional game had surpassed the amateur game. Hagen wanted to win, and he wanted to win decisively. Indeed, of all the victories in a lifetime full of triumph, the 11 majors, the British Opens, the US Opens, the PGA Championships, Hagen would later call his victory in this match my greatest thrill in golf. Well, the press went wild. This was exactly the kind of narrative that the sports pages of the 1920s lived for. The stately amateur versus the flamboyant professional. The quiet Georgian versus the showman from Rochester. Golf's version of a clash of civilizations. I want you to think for a moment about the psychological dimensions of this match. Hagen was a master of what we would call today the mental game. He understood, perhaps better than any golfer of his era, that golf is played as much between the ears as anywhere else. He was a genius at gamesmanship, not in any dishonest sense, but in the sense that he knew how to use his presence, his timing, his sheer personality to unsettle an opponent. He was almost impossible to rattle. Bad shots didn't seem to trouble him. He had a gift for letting go and moving on that was, frankly, extraordinary. It is part of what made him arguably the greatest match play golfer in history. In 1926, he was in the middle of winning 4 consecutive PGA championships, a tournament played at match play in those days. That is not a coincidence. Bobby Jones was wired differently. He felt everything. He was internally volatile in a way that spectators rarely saw, but that was very real. The intensity of his concentration was both his greatest strength and his demanding burden. He had worked over the years of competition to build the kind of composure that Haig seemed to wear effortlessly. And by 1926, he had largely succeeded, but there was always a terrible emotional cost. Bub would go on to become a formidable match player in his own right. Of course, even at this point, he was no slouch in this format, having won the U.S. Amateur both in 1924 and 1925. However, up till this time, he was never as comfortable head-to-head as he was in stroke play. By early 1926, he had yet to really learn the particular psychological lessons that match play competition demands. Haig was about to teach him. The match began here, on these grounds. I find myself imagining what it must have looked like, the galleries gathering in the cool of a February morning, the low winter sun casting long shadows across the fairways, the 2 men teeing it up in front of a crowd that had come from across Florida, 1,200 of them lining this golf course to witness something they sensed would be remembered. Haig arrived, well, as was his custom, at the last possible moment. Accounts suggest he had been up late the night before. This was not unusual for the Haig, as we've learned, and that he was as untroubled by this as he was by everything else. He stepped to the tee as though arriving at a garden party. Bub, by contrast, was all focus. He was meticulous in his preparation, precise in his routines. He had done everything right. He was ready. And then they played golf. The early holes did not go well for Bub. Haig, as was his peculiar genius, managed to make the whole affair seem casual, and yet his ball kept finding the right places at the right times. Bub found himself pressing, which was never a good sign. When Bobby Jones began to press, when the internal temperature rose above a certain point, the results were not always what he hoped for. Obie Keeler, the sports writer for the Atlanta Journal, who accompanied Bub to almost every important championship he played in, was there and recorded everything. He described a moment on the 6th hole of the afternoon round that captures the match perfectly. Bub had just won the 5th hole to cut Haig's lead to 3 up and had striped a beautiful drive down the fairway. Haig, who had been missing drives all afternoon, pushed his tee shot to the edge of the rough where a pine tree blocked his path to the green. He hit what Keeler called as wretched a shot as can be imagined, a topped ball that rolled straight toward a sand trap guarding the front of the green. Any sane spectator, Keeler wrote, would have concluded that Jones had won the hole and was about to stage a rally. Instead, the topped ball kept running, ran through the trap, wriggled up onto the green a dozen feet from the pin. Bub's perfect pitch left him 2 feet away, but his 2-foot putt rimmed the cup and stayed out. Haig, putting with what Keeler called incredible daring and accuracy, holed his putt for a birdie. Bub went 4 down instead of 2 down. Keeler later wrote, "I will always believe that that was the turning point of the match." By the end of the first 36 holes here in Sarasota, Haig had built a commanding lead, 8 holes up. The following Sunday, the match moved up the road to St. Petersburg, and the story there was not materially different. Haig was simply magnificent, playing some of the finest golf of his life at precisely the moment it mattered most. In the third round at Pasadena, Haig shot a blistering 69. The press, never at a loss for a good line, observed, "Walter went around in 69 strokes, Bobby went around in 69 cigarettes." The final result was a Haig victory, 12 and 11, 12 holes up with 11 holes to play. It was decisive, comprehensive, and undeniable. There is a postscript to the match worth mentioning. Walter Haig stated in his biography that he was paid $7,600 for appearance in the match, though official records put the figure at $5,800. Haig can be forgiven for this discrepancy. He always did have a flair for a good story. Bobby Jones, being an amateur, received nothing, or almost nothing. Haig presented him with a pair of solid gold cufflinks. Bub always prized them and kept them for the rest of his life. Now, you might expect that this is the part of the story where I tell you that Bobby Jones was devastated, that the loss haunted him, that a great rivalry was born. You would be wrong. What happened instead, and this is the part of the story I love the most, is that Bobby Jones was gracious in defeat in a way that revealed everything about his character. He made no excuses. He did not question the conditions or the format. He said plainly that Haig had played wonderful golf and that he himself had not played well enough to win. He shook Haig's hand, he meant it, and that was that. Years later, Bub would describe it as a glorious licking. Far and away, he said, the most complete defeat he had ever experienced in match play. He did not say it with bitterness. He said it as a man who had been beaten fair and square by someone better on that day and who knew it. And Haig was generous in victory. He did not gloat. He did not perform. He was warm and funny, and he said something to the effect that he hoped that they would play again soon. Haig, for his part, was moved by the dignity with which Bub conducted himself throughout. At the conclusion of the match, he said, "Jones realizes that the professional makes his living out of the game. I want the world to know that I appreciate his attitude and that I consider his action the most generous in the history of American sport." At the end of the day, the truth was, Walter Haig genuinely liked Bobby Jones, and Bobby Jones genuinely liked Walter Haig. The match, rather than creating a rivalry, deepened an already strong friendship. You know, there's a particular kind of friendship that can only exist between people who have competed at the highest level. A friendship built on a form of understanding that is almost wordless. A recognition of what the other person has endured, what it cost them, what it has given them. Bub and the Haig had that. On the surface, they were an improbable pair, the amateur and the professional, the Southern gentleman and the working-class showman from New York, the introvert and the extrovert. And yet they found in each other something that each of them valued, the real thing, the genuine article. A person who was, beneath all the trappings, exactly who they appeared to be. Haig never pretended to be someone he wasn't. This was, I think, something Bub found enormously refreshing. The world was full of people who performed versions of themselves in Bobby Jones' company, people who were nervous or deferential or trying too hard. Hagen didn't do any of that. He was Hagen, fully and without apology, and he treated Bub as an equal and a friend. Jones, for his part, gave Hagen something equally important: the respect of a man who did not give respect lightly. Bub did not suffer fools graciously, or at least that's what he always said. He had no patience with pretension. But when he found someone he genuinely admired for their talent, for their integrity, for their humanity, his loyalty was absolute. And in Bub's gracious acknowledgement of Sir Walter's victory, Hagen saw something he had spent his entire career fighting for: the first glimmers of acceptance by the patrician establishment that had so long snubbed him and players like him. It was perhaps as important to him as the victory itself. Over the decades that followed the 1926 match, the two men remained in each other's lives, bound by the small, specific world of people who had competed at the very highest levels of golf and understood each other in ways that few others could. There were dinners, letters, and the easy warmth of people who don't need to explain themselves to one another. There is one moment from that friendship that I find particularly touching. When my father was born in November of 1926, and yes, if you do the math, he was conceived in Sarasota. A special package arrived in the mail. It was a replica of Walter Hagen's putter, a solid sterling silver head on a hickory shaft, engraved on the back in elegant cursive, "To Bobby III, with love from Uncle Walter." By the 1960s, both men were in physical decline. Bub had been diagnosed with syringomyelia, a devastating disease of the spinal cord, and had been confined largely to a wheelchair for years. The man who had once moved through the world with such athletic grace was now dependent on others for the most basic activities. He bore this with a dignity and a lack of self-pity that those around him found extraordinary. Even those closest to him never knew what it cost him. Hagen died in October of 1969 after a long and courageous battle with cancer. He was 76 years old. Bobby Jones mourned him deeply. When Bub died just over 2 years later, in December of 1971, he joined his old friend in eternity with a record and a life that needed no embellishment. What I find myself thinking about when I think about their friendship is how rare it is in any field, at any level, to find someone who truly sees you. Not the version of you that the world has constructed, not the champion or the legend or the image on the trophy, just you. I believe Bub and the Haig saw each other that way. And that is why I think the friendship lasted. I want to come back at the end to where we are. You are sitting in a place that was part of the world of Bobby Jones and Walter Hagen. The sunlight that shines through the windows of this club is the same Florida sunlight that they played under. The sea out there is the same water that they looked out at. History is not always abstract. Sometimes it lives in a specific place, in a particular quality of air, in a piece of ground that people you love once walked on. I've spent a great deal of my professional life thinking about what makes people excellent, what psychological qualities allow some individuals to perform at levels that most of us can barely imagine. And when I think about Bub, I keep coming back to the same things. His capacity for concentration, his emotional sensitivity, his absolute refusal to make excuses, and perhaps most surprisingly, his capacity for genuine friendship, his willingness to be known. People would sometimes ask Bub in those championship years what he planned to do when he finally retired from competitive golf. It was a question he never seemed entirely comfortable answering for himself, but he had a solution to that. He would turn to Keeler, who had a gift for finding the right words when Bub preferred not to search for them himself. And Keeler, who was deeply literate and knew it, would reach into the library of his mind for these words from the poet Hilaire Belloc. If I ever become a rich man, or if ever I grow to be old, I will build a house with deep thatch to shelter me from the cold. I will hold my house in the high wood within a walk of the sea, and the men that were boys when I was a boy shall sit and drink with me. That, I think, is the truest thing that Bobby Jones ever said about himself, even though someone else said it for him. Because here's what I believe he understood. In the marrow of his bones, even at the height of his fame, that championships are wonderful, but they are not the point. The point is the companionship. The point is the fellowship, the shared language of people that have played the game together, competed together, tested themselves against each other and against the course, and come off the 18th green still friends. The point is the men that were boys when you were a boy, sitting with you at the end of the day. That is what a golf club, at its best, has always been. Not a place just to keep score, but a place to keep faith with the game and with each other. Sarah Bay has been that kind of place. It was that kind of place when Bobby Jones and Walter Hagen played here nearly 100 years ago, and it is that kind of place today. The match of the century is a wonderful story. In the winter of 1926, the entire golf world focused on the question of who was the greatest golfer. To a large extent, that question was answered here at Sarah Bay. By the end of the year, that question would have a different answer, as Bub incorporated the lessons of the match here in South Florida. But there was a greater question answered, a question that concerns us in 2026. What is the nature of friendship? In the match of the century, two men who could have become bitter rivals chose instead to become even closer friends. And that friendship, unlikely, warm, and lasting, tells us more about who they were and who we may be than any scorecard ever could. I'll take any questions that you may have. The nice thing is, if I really don't know the answer, I can go ahead and just make up something, and who's going to know, right?
I guess I never knew that his only relationship with a championship
Yes.
I don't know whether it's a scheduling and travel issue.
Well, partially. He always thought that the British Amateur was the most difficult of all the majors to win because it was held at 18-hole matches up until the final, and then the final was at 36 holes. And by 1930, Bub believed that that almost nobody could beat him at 36 holes of golf, but that anybody could get hot and beat him over a course of 18. And he used to run into the most bizarre things in the British Amateur. In the 1930 British Amateur, he played against a Welsh coal miner named Sid Roper in the first round. And Bub played something like the first 5 holes at something like 4 under par, and was 1 up against Roper. And I mean, the guy just never gave up. And Bub's dream of the Grand Slam could have ended before it even began. So, yeah, but that's why. Yes, sir.
Dr. Phillips, thank you for being here tonight.
My honor.
Such a wonderful presentation on the eve of exploration. So thank you so much for being here. My question is that your grandfather retired at 28.
Yes.
And do you have any sense that he had any regrets about that later in life?
No, never. He had set that goal of winning all 4 in the same year. He actually set that goal privately in 1926 when he won the double. Once he won the double, he realized if he could win the 2 Open championships, then he realized if he could win he knew he could win the 2 amateur championships. And so he never really had any doubt. And by 1926, he made the decision that 1930 was going to be it. He looked at what the calendar was going to be. He realized that the amateur was going to be at St. Andrews, the Open was going to be at Hoylake, and then the American tournaments would be at Interlaken in Minneapolis, or outside of Minneapolis, I think, or in Minnesota, and at Marion. Interestingly enough, he ended his career at the place where he began it, at Marion Golf Club. But yeah, he never had any, he wanted to get home. And you know, as he used to say, he wanted to get back to the practice of law and raising a family. And golf just took too much. He also said, at one point, he also said that, well, you know, and there's also, I mean, there just really isn't enough money in golf to make it really worthwhile. And so why turn pro? Hagen said, if Bobby Jones turned pro, there would be. And so. Yes, sir. All the way in the back and then up front.
Appreciate everything you've done. I want to, and I'm not sure this is a real true fact, but when he was brought down here to sell real estate from the Adair Realty, he had a room over there in that apartment building.
That may very well be. You know, I do not know. And it's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about getting this presentation ready is that this is a part of my grandfather's life that I've really known very little about. Partially that's because from the time I was born, his health was so bad that he never traveled much outside of either his home or his law office. So there are a number of places, Sarasota, Highlands, North Carolina, places that were very important to him that had long since passed off his radar just because his health wouldn't allow it. So I would not be surprised if that were the case.
Babe Ruth and all them would room over in that building, which was, I believe, and I don't know the history of that building across the street, but they would all rent rooms there and come in and stay and then play here.
That would be very interesting. My grandmother, who was probably the most proper human being that has ever been born, one time when my grandparents had dinner with Babe Ruth, my grandmother was simply appalled because Babe Ruth ate 2 steaks. Of course, she could eat chicken with a knife and a fork. I mean, you know, so, yes.
Was Hagen in the field where Jones put the
Oh, yes. Absolutely. And, you know, the question was Hagen in the field when Jones won his Open championships? The answer is yes, absolutely he was. And Bub's record in those Open championships was unbelievable. I mean, he played in 4 British Opens and won 3 of them. In the United States Open, he played in 10 of them. He won 4 of them, was a runner-up in 4. 2 of those he lost in a playoff, and 1 he only got into the playoff because he called a one-shot penalty on himself. And then he only finished out of the top 10 once in his entire 10 times playing in the U.S. Open, and that was when he finished in a tie for 11th. The other thing that I think is really interesting, he must have learned something from Hagen, because in match play, nobody ever defeated him twice in his entire career. So he must have learned something from Sir Walter. There was a question. Yes, sir.
Famously, he was the first person to do instructional videos.
Yes.
Wondering if there's any sort of narrative or family history about, because those, I mean, there are, not me, but there are people in this room that watch those things to this day. And
Well, why don't you?
I think because the game, starts with the hickory swing and how that works, and then it moves into Byron Nelson and steel shafts and how that's going. So perhaps, but I wonder if there was any talk in the family about how that all went down. He had to go to California to do it. He was famously produced.
Oh, yeah. There's quite a bit of a story in the family about that, and I'll share them with you. I don't share this with too many people, so you guys are really getting in some here. My grandfather had on his coffee table this book that was black leather with gold, and it said, and on the cover it had United States versus Jones. And I said to my dad once, I said, "What in the world is this thing?" He said, "This is the only legal case that your grandfather ever tried." And I said, "Well, why is it here?" He said, "Well, he lost." And I said, "Well, why is he keeping that on his coffee table?" He said, "Because he always wants to stay humble." And I was like, okay. Well, let me tell you the story about that. There was a story that was told that one time my grandfather had been hired by a railroad to defend them in a wrongful death claim against this woman whose husband had died in a train accident. And the case was supposedly tried in Macon, which is about 60 miles south of Atlanta, and that Bub had gone down to Macon, and that the night before the case went to trial, Bub played golf with the judge and also with the other counsel, and they just played golf at Idle Hour Country Club. And the next day they came in, did the case, and the judge ruled in favor of the railroad. And Bub was so appalled that his playing golf with the judge may have adversely influenced the judge's opinion, that what he said was, he said he just wasn't going to have it. He walked over to the lady right there on the spot, and he wrote her a check personally for the damages that she had been asking for. Now, isn't that the sweetest story you've ever heard? And it is totally, totally false. In 1930, Bub signed a contract with Warner Brothers for the sum of $175,000. He would later sign another one for $75,000 to make another series of movies. And his goal was, or what he planned on doing, was that he was going to create 3 trusts, one for each of his children. So he got the check from Warner Brothers. But before he created the trusts, he endorsed the check and deposited it into his bank. Fine and dandy. So he creates the trust. 5 months later, he gets a letter from the Internal Revenue Service who said, "Congratulations, Mr. Jones, you created a taxable event and you owe the Internal Revenue Service some ungodly amount of money. Well, Bub decided he was going to contest that. So he went down to the United States Tax Court, which back in those days was located in Macon, Georgia, because that was in the center of the state. And Bub did, in fact, play golf with the judge at idle hour. He did play golf with the United States tax attorney at idle hour in that same group. And the next day, the judge came back and after a 15-minute hearing said, Mr. Jones, you've incurred a taxable event. Before you leave, please write a check to the United States Treasury. So there was a woman who did make some money that day, but it was Lady Liberty. So, and now you know the true story. Two came up at once. We'll go to the back and then up front.
What golfers, male and female, do you think your grandfather would most identify with?
Currently? Oof. That's a really hard question. I know who he identified mostly during his day. He thought that a lady, Joyce Weathered, had the finest golf swing that he had ever seen, male or female. He also deeply admired the golf game of Horton Smith, who won 2 of the early Masters. Today, it would be hard to say. I think he would have to admire. I'm sure he would think a lot of like the game that Ernie Els played. Kind of hard to argue with that rhythm. As far as the women's game, I think what he would be the most impressed with is the quality of the women's game overall today. I think that would just be something he would be very, very proud of. You know, people think I don't realize it, but one of Bub's closest friends was a lady named Marian Hollins who developed a course Pasatiempo out in California and was a strong advocate for women's golf back when that was a really, really rare thing. And also one of his other dearest friends was a lady he grew up with, Alexa Sterling Fraser, who won 3 consecutive U.S. amateur championships back when that was the championship of the United States. She probably would have won 5 except for this pesky little thing named World War I that intervened. But that's about as close as I can get to answer that question. But certainly it would be Joyce Weathered from his day, at least. You had a question also?
I was just curious as to whether or not your grandfather encouraged your father or you as his grandson to play golf.
No. In fact, my dad started playing golf, and this would have been about 1945. And Stuart Maiden had just been hired to be the head pro at Peachtree, which was under construction at the time. And Stuart was dying of cancer by this time. And anyway, my grandfather told Stuart, young Bob wants to learn to play. And he said, I want you to give him a lesson that will discourage him like forever. So Bub sends Dad out to meet Stuart at Peachtree at 8 o'clock in the morning. And Stuart's sitting at this table with an umbrella over him, you know, and everything. And he's got this big, huge bucket of balls there and this bucket of something else to his side. And Dad starts hitting balls at like 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, by 12 noon, he puts his club down. He starts heading into the clubhouse. And Stuart, with that thick brogue of his, goes, where are you going, lad? And Dad said, well, Stuart, I'm going to take some lunch. And Stuart said, I don't take lunch, keep hitting. So Dad keeps hitting. By 2:30, his hands were bloody, all right? So he turns to Stuart. He said, I got to quit, Stuart. Look at my hands. And Stuart goes, stick them in the bucket. And it was a bucket of brine. And so Dad does it, because you did not do what Stuart told you. And so he goes, well, now what? Stuart said, keep hitting. But here's the problem. Stuart double-crossed Dad, Bub, rather. Stuart could not teach. And so whenever Dad had hit a shot, Stuart would make a little tweak here or a little tweak there. To make a long story short, the next year, Dad won the city amateur, and he went on to compete in 3 national amateur champions and be an outstanding regional golfer. And so, so Stuart couldn't not teach. Yes.
Could you give a little background on his relationship with Alistair McKenzie and the founding of Augusta National?
Oh, sure. Happy to. There's sort of this myth that there are a lot of myths that surround that. For example, one of the myths was that Donald Ross was deeply hurt that he was not selected to design Augusta National, and that he was so angry he designed Pinehurst No. 2 to show what he could do. That's a great story that once again also has no basis in truth whatsoever. Alistair McKenzie was an extremely close friend of Bub's. They had gotten to know each other in 1926 when the Walker Cup was played at St. Andrews. And Dr. McKenzie walked every hole that Bub played during that match alongside Obie Keeler. And then when the British Open came back there the next year, same thing. McKenzie walked the entire way with Keeler. They became very, very good friends. In 1929, when the U.S. Amateur was played for the first time west of the Mississippi at Pebble Beach, Bub was expected to win that going away, and instead he was defeated in the first round by an unknown named Johnny Goodman. Goodman would later on go to be the last amateur to ever win a U.S. Open, but nobody had heard of him at the time. And then McKenzie had invited him to play. He was going to play at the opening of Pasatiempo, which is a McKenzie design. And McKenzie invited him to play around at Cypress Point, which had not yet opened. And Bub was very impressed with Cypress Point and thought it was one of the greatest layouts he'd ever seen. But he still wasn't his first choice to design Augusta National. Bub was concerned that if he hired somebody like Ross or McKenzie, that they may want to insert their own will too much into the project. So the person that he retained to design Augusta National was an English architect named Sir Guy Campbell. And if you've not heard of Sir Guy Campbell, do not worry about that. Nobody else has either, because Sir Guy, unfortunately, had the habit of dying before he could start the Augusta project. And at that point, Bub was left with a choice of who was he going to get to do the project. And in that situation, it was McKenzie. That's how that came about.
I've always heard that that person was actually Seth Rayner.
No. I mean, you know, that's one of those that if it isn't true, it should be, but no. That would have been nice because I've never, you know, strangely enough, I've never played a Seth Rayner course. I want to, never have. That's what I hear.
Well, thank you. Dr. Jones, we've got a little something for you here.
Oh, thank you. Ah,
Sarah Bay history book, hot off the press.
cool.
A lot of your grandfather is in there.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
And also, to commemorate the match, we've had this plaque elaborately covered. That plaque that is going to be put out by the clock room. And I don't know if you can hear me, but it reads, on February 28, 1926, the match of the century was played here when Sara Bay was known as Whitfield Estates Country Club. It featured Bobby Jones, legendary amateur golfer, versus Walter Haig, the top professional in the game. It was a match play event. The first 36 holes played here, and the final 36 played 1 week later at Pasadena Country Club. Hagen won 12 and 11. Bobby Jones described it as the worst rubbing of his career. Later that summer, Bobby Jones won both the British Open and the U.S. Open, becoming the first golfer to win both consecutively.